It's a hard one to wrap your head around. You got to leave. You got to get out of here. He said he didn't make it, and that's all he would tell. My name is Eric Szilagyi. I am the host of a podcast called Uncomfortable, and I've been doing that for just about 3 years now. And a large portion of my show encompasses episodes that revolve around the topic of Bigfoot. It wasn't something that I necessarily went after, even though it does fall into the umbrella of paranormal and high strangeness. It has always been a topic that has interested me. I guess maybe interested is not quite the right word. I think my interest in it was a little bit heavier than most. I think even as a teen, when I would get into a conversation about it, I would get the weird looks and the eye rolls, and rarely back in those days did I ever run into anybody that would would entertain a conversation with me about it. But it's always been something that has struck me in a manner that is not um, fanciful. It is always from the moment that I first saw the Patterson Gimlin film, even though it's extremely shaky in its original form. There's much better versions of it now where they ran it through AI and um, they've they've done some making the screen not so shaky. Even that very first time that I saw it, I was never struck as that's a guy in a suit or that is something fake. It seemed extremely organic to me. It seemed like that creature was not having holes in a mask or anything like that. It just seemed extraordinarily organic. And I've never I've never lost that. I have seen, that's not to say I haven't seen many videos and many things that don't strike me that way, and that they, to me, have a lot of red flags in it, and it is a perpetrated hoax or somebody trying to get something over on somebody. But there are those few unicorns out there that continue to keep me enthralled by the subject of it. Um,
You
as I,
mentioned the Patterson Gimlin film.
yes,
So many people have brought this to my attention that if this were a fake um, person in a suit of some sort, that probably they wouldn't have put breast on this person.
it seems like a very odd thing to go that route, doesn't it? I mean, it seems like, now the one thing I will say is that I believe there was a publication of some sort. I feel bad because I don't remember this, but it was either put out by Bob Gimlin or Patterson, where it was um, a small publication, and in that they referenced it as a female. But that came out before the Patterson Gimlin film. So there are some people that say that that is kind of a clue to this having been a hoax because that's what they wrote about, and that's what's the likelihood of that is what they got to film. Um, and there's some investigators out there who are firmly in the camp that that is a hoax. By and large, the research community does tend to rally around that film as quintessential proof that they do exist. But there are a few out there, and sometimes when I talk to those people, I almost wonder if they're doing that just to kind of get a rise out of people, to get people to take notice of them, and as an attention getter. Um, because I fancy myself to be a very logical, very science minded person. I am not prone to making stuff up. I'm not prone to hallucinations. I'm not prone to not living in reality. And there are some things that you'll see that just don't look right. Fluidity that you would expect of a living creature. We are very graceful creatures. You see a woman walking down the street or you see a man walking down the street, more times than not, you don't see them struggling with, trying to have forward motivation or anything. Um, but if you put an oversized costume on them and something that would have big floppy feet and a big mask on that would be trying to increase your size, make you look larger. Um, it just seems almost impossible to navigate fluidly, especially in the terrain that film was taken in. So to me, that was early on. That was one of the main things that I always looked at as you don't see any fumbling at all. The only shakiness is in the film because of the guy that was filming it. Um, when you when motion stops and he has found a rest on the log, and you see those few steps as it's turning back, looking at the camera, swinging its arms, there's just nothing about it that looks fake to me. I don't see a zipper going down the back. I don't see any of these things that people report, having the knowledge of to say that this is fake. Um,
So you saw this film and this kind of set in motion in your mind that Bigfoot was probably a real creature out there somewhere.
yeah, I think it was in grade school, definitely in grade school, and I had gone down to the library and I had checked out a book. Um, I was a little ahead of my time in grade school. One book I got was on internal human combustion. Uh, and that had a couple of stories of well documented internal combustion. And then when I got done with that, the next book I went and got was a double book. It was like half the book, the front cover, and the first half of the book was about the Loch Ness monster. So it was like a twofer, and that was my first. That was the first peek at Patty because there was a still image. There might have been two of them in there. A still image from the PG film in that book, and at that point, it didn't strike me as being obviously real. It wasn't until I believe it was 1977 when it first aired on In Search of with Leonard Nimoy. That's the first time that I saw the actual film in its 53 or 56 seconds of totality. And when I saw that I couldn't. I mean, I'm 58, and back in 1977, we didn't have VCRs, we didn't have on-demand recording. You couldn't set it to your DVR to record or anything, and reruns were not as widely done as they are now. So, it was very few and far between did you get to see anything about UFOs or the, the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot or any of that stuff. So,
It does seem like Bigfoot has become a far more popular subject in even just the last several years. Have you noticed that as well?
oh, it's definitely become very deeply seated in our popular culture, pop culture. Um, and I mean, I have two sides of thought to it. I mean, I host a Bigfoot conference in southwestern Michigan. Um, I have speakers come in. I have people who are interested in the subject. It's a great day. We hold it at a brewery. They have great food. You get to drink while you get to listen to the speakers. And I try to bring people in I've done it 2 years now, and I try to bring people in who have. Um, I want to be careful how I say this. I don't want the speakers that I have there are not stale. All right. They haven't been at every Bigfoot conference throughout the US from the West Coast to the East Coast. It's not always the same people. I did have Ron Moorhead for the lead speaker for the first year. And, the Sierra Sounds have been around a long time. And I think just about everything you can say about them has been said, and the investigations behind the linguistics and the um, to come to the determination that there is an actual language being spoke there. The linguistics expert, I forget his name right off the top of my head.
Oh,
Um,
Scott Nelson? Scott
Scott
Nelson?
Nelson. Yep. Scott Nelson. He determined there's terminations in their sentences, there's exclamations in their sentences, there's a couple of words that are repeated throughout the vocalizations. So there is in his expert opinion, which you really can't argue with, because I mean the man was in the linguistics in the military for over 20 years. That was his primary job. But that's all been said. But given that Ron Moorhead had come out with Quantum Bigfoot, that was something that I had not seen him speak about at other conferences. Everybody tends to kind of shy away from the the spooky, weird, woo type aspects of what some people encounter with these creatures. So when I brought him in, yes, obviously the Sierra Sounds were a big part of it, but we also dove into his book, The Quantum Bigfoot, and what exactly he was trying to get across, and to help people understand that these things might be a bit different than us, in their physiology, in their possible origins and stuff like that. And I think it's important, hosting the podcast. I get to talk to a menagerie of people and different experiences. And quite honestly, there's some that come on that when they tell you what they've gone through, it's it's a hard one to wrap your head around. You want to fight that that urge to believe it, because it just seems outrageously ridiculous.
Well, what are a few of
Um,
those examples that's been difficult for you to digest?
hmm. Well, one in particular, um, and it's related to Bigfoot. Gentleman, I think it was during the first year. Um, he and a couple of neighborhood friends had um, basically become friends with a juvenile Bigfoot, and it hung around their homes. They found it out in the fields. They were at one point led into this wooded area where there was um, a den that was kind of woven out of sticks and limbs. And once they got inside there, they found shiny little trinkets that had been, scavenged from the trash or found on the road. Um, and for a summer, they pretty much had this thing as an extra playmate. Um, and I mean, the depth of the depth of this story, and this gentleman's ability to tell this story without fumbling over words, without ever going and repeating something he had already said. Um, he always had an answer to every question. It culminated with um, some government officials coming into the picture, National Guard in particular, that showed up in carpet cleaning vans, I believe it was, and they wanted to find the the entity, and obviously the kids didn't want anything to come, no harm to come to it, so they were playing coy and not being truthful. Apparently, his parents were um, held against their will, duct taped to chairs, and threatened. And eventually, the boy was supposedly taken by this U.S. agent and placed in a vehicle, driven north to Grand Rapids, about 45 or 50 minutes north of their home, taken to Grand Rapids, where he was hypnotized and uh, basically had his memory either erased or replaced.
That is quite an amazing story.
It is an amazing story.
I've had several interviews, but this is one I have not heard yet.
During the course of the experiences that the kid had, he went up into his parents' barn and was playing up in the hayloft, which apparently he did on a regular basis. While he was up there, he started to notice that a rope that was hanging off of a pulley, I imagine used to hoist um, straw bales or hay bales up to the loft, started moving and squeaking. And the next thing he saw was a hairy set of hands climbing up the rope. The juvenile Bigfoot got off the rope and was up there in the loft with him. And they started to have a kind of a series of, look what I can do. Can you do it? So, the kid would make, do a somersault, and then this thing would mimic it and do a somersault. And um, they went back and forth doing those things several times. And at the end of it, he stood up and he beat his chest and kind of did like a Tarzan call. Apparently, at this point, the juvenile Sasquatch um, mimicked it, but tenfold, was much louder, much more aggressive. And he said that at that point, the creature's eyes began to show red, and it basically attacked him, knocked him down onto his back, mounted him, and started to rip his clothes off. Apparently, this guy has a considerable scar down on his lower abdomen where this thing had scratched him really bad and he had to have stitches. Um, he was fearful for his life. He thought the thing was going to kill him. Just in the nick of time, out of the side upper story side window of the barn, the mother Sasquatch reaches in, grabs its young one, and at this point, the dad is trying to get up into the loft with a gun, and the female reaches in and grabs the child as well and tries to make her way out. The dad wrestles with him, gets his son away from it. They think everything's over with, but then the juvenile comes back and starts to try to break into. They had closed the door and they had like shut the window. The juvenile stuck its arm through a hole in the wall, tried to grab the gun away from the dad. At this point, a couple of police officers showed up. An ambulance showed up. I assume was called by the mother. I don't recall exactly. And then at some point, the juvenile gets away from the mother, goes to one of the other kids' house, and gets into their home. and the father shoots it and kills it. They put it on a picnic table. One of the neighbors decides that he's going to dissect it there on the picnic table, opens it up, finds that it has two hearts, finds that when you pull the head back as to open the mouth, that the large canines, as the mouth opens, large canines would protrude through the gums, and almost as if they retracted. When the mouth was closed, they'd be recessed, and when they opened wide, that they would come out. Um, Apparently, the kid and a couple of the neighbors were standing there watching this dissection happen. Um, it's a crazy story. It has components to it that I've heard in other things, in other stories. You know, the government involvement, the agents, you know, the wiping of your memory and all that stuff.
Well, if the
The
agents wiped out the kid's memory, how was he able to remember these things?
well, there you go. Um, you know, through whatever method this gentleman had gone through his life, started to get memories back. And so much so that he apparently has tracked down and knows where each of these offending individuals, government officials, um, the military that was there, he's tracked them all down, knows where they all live, and he is very much wants to exact his revenge for what they did to him in some way, shape, or form at some point. Um, you know, the dad no longer has a relationship with the dad, no longer has a relationship with his mom. His sister just happened to be at some friend's house for the last weekend of summer, so she wasn't there to witness any of this. You know, when you if you try to put on the mask of being a lawyer, or you know, trying to prove something to a court of law, you know, there's a lot of stuff being said, yet when you, okay, who else witnessed this, can we talk to them, you know, there's nobody there. um that's not to say it's not true, but you know, the longer that I do this show, and my shows don't typically go 45 minutes to an hour. My shows, by and large, go 90 minutes. Several of them go 2 hours. I've had some go 2.5 hours. When the conversation is there and they're willing to talk, I give them all the time they need to get through their story. So, you know, it's never like, okay, we got to move on because we're running out of time. I don't do that. Um, at at a couple of points during the interview, again in the kind of in my vetting process at the beginning before I even record with them, a lot of times I'll have a conversation with somebody over the phone just to see, are they going to have a good feel for the show? Are they going to, you know, make them more comfortable with me? And, you know, I get an idea. I don't want a lot of spoilers or anything, but I get an idea of, you know, what we're talking about and where this could potentially go. And then again afterwards, multiple times he referenced a neighbor who had very good camera equipment and had his own dark room in his basement. And that he knew for a fact that this guy had been taking pictures of children in compromised positions. And I thought, man, what a weird thing to bring up. That's a that's not something that has anything to do with Bigfoot. Why would, not only in the conversation before, a couple of times during the interview, and then again after the interview. About a year later, this guy goes on to another paranormal podcast, which is very well known and considerably larger than mine, um, and tells the same story. Close, but there were some different aspects to the story. He followed the same timeline. He followed the same major sets of occurrences, but there were additional things that he omitted when he talked to me. And then there were things that he said to me that he omitted from this other show. I happened to know the host of this other show, and I called him after I had seen that he was on his episode. And I said, "Hey, do me a favor and just be honest with me. Did you get the overwhelming sense that this guy had been abused as a child, sexually abused?" And he said, "Yep, 100%. So I knew I wasn't off in his commentary about the guy with the camera in the dark room and taking pictures of kids. You know, when you when you talk to people who have had UFO experiences or extraterrestrial experiences and stuff like that, there's often talked about these screen memories, that they know that they've been abducted, but the reality in their brain has created this cover story to minimize the reliving of the trauma. And the more that I kept looking at this, and I could be completely wrong, and if I am, I'll have no problem admitting it. But to me, the fact that he knows everybody, he knows where they're at, he knows where they work, but he hasn't been able to call them out on anything. He hasn't been able to, get any of them to admit that they did this. On top of the fact that there's nobody in his family that experienced this that is available to talk now because there's no relationships whatsoever. The one person that he still has a relationship conveniently wasn't there that weekend when all this happened. Makes me think that this guy had some sexual trauma in his youth, and he may have. I like to believe that in its infancy, there was an experience. Maybe they did see something out in the cornfield. Maybe they did see something out in the woods where they used to play. But by and large, the massive story that unfolded, I think is and I hope I'm wrong, but I think it's a cover story. And by coming on the show and telling this story, even though he didn't come out and say that this happened, the abuse or the trauma, I think it was still his way of getting it off his chest, and still by dropping that little nugget about the guy with the camera, and then a little bit more about him getting caught, doing some shady stuff. And then finally, by the end, coming out that this guy was taking neighborhood kids down in his basement, taking pictures of them and developing the pictures in his own darkroom. I can't help but think that this is probably more the truth of what happened.
So how would the government play into that? I mean, the fact that he didn't have clear memory of his, maybe of all of this trauma that happened to him. That seems like a lot to insert into that.
Agreed. And there are God, I hope I don't get in trouble for talking about this. Um, by somebody listening to me and saying, why did you put it on then? And the answer to that, if I felt this way, why did I air the episode? It was not my intention to be disingenuous to my listeners just because this was a crazy Bigfoot story and everybody's going to eat it up. If it's true, what I'm feeling is the truth. And this was his way of getting it off his chest. It was his way of telling a mass amount of people that something bad had happened to him as a child. But he told it in this way where it was hidden. I think it was still cathartic for him. And it probably did more good for him to be able to talk about this event, just like anybody else who would have had, sexual abuse or trauma. If you keep it bottled up and you keep it inside, it's going to eat you up. So, um, I released the episode. I do think at some point that the topic that was chosen to cover this up stems from some truth. So, like I said, I think, as a child, maybe he saw something in the woods, maybe he saw something within the tree line, and, this was a convenient way for his brain to go over it. As far as the military is concerned, and this special agent that showed up, um, the special agent's name was actually the same name of a character that was in one of the adult cartoons. I don't know if it was Family Guy or um, American Dad or something like that. It's a Native American guy. The guy in this story is Native American, and his name is the same as the Native American guy in the cartoon. So, either he's using that to not put that guy's real name out there, or it's like, did you not put that much thought into it that somebody would eventually at some point recognize that?
So going back to, the young boys, let me see if I got this straight. The young boys friended this Bigfoot, juvenile Bigfoot, and then this other incident happened in the barn loft.
Mm-hmm.
And then the agent showed up at some point.
Yes. It's been a year and a half, close to 2 years. So my recollection of when exactly the government showed up is a little hazy. After the dissection on the picnic table, they took the body and they threw it beside the one neighbor's house barn and covered it with, I don't know if they flipped the picnic table over on top of it so that, nobody would see it. But at that point, the agent had come back and was pressuring the kid who is telling this story as an adult, pressured him to, where's the body? They wanted to get the body back. And apparently there was some laughter going on because they were basically hiding it in plain sight, and these guys weren't able to see it. Now, all that being said, the area that this kid lived in when this happened is in a part of Michigan that is widely known as a hot spot, and several local researchers in the state of Michigan that I know personally have actually investigated that area. And I was privy to some vocalizations that were recorded in that area. And to listen to them, you would almost think that was like extra footage from the Sierra sounds that had never been released before because they sounded extraordinarily similar in that it's that chatter that almost sounds like a foreign language, almost like Russian or something. Um, very, very similar to the Sierra sounds. And I know that there have been people that are researching that area and that it is, uh, there's been considerable evidence pulled out of that area. Um, so, I mean, I guess that the possibility exists that it could be true. I really question, and it makes me hesitate when that one little thing about the guy, the neighbor guy with the camera in the dark room and getting in trouble for taking pictures of the kids. That to me is very troubling in this story.
How did he bring that up? I mean, you said he mentioned it several times. How did that segue into mentioning the neighbor? And did he give the neighbor's name? Was there any way to contact the neighbor?
That's the other thing. There were no names given. The only name that was given was his name, the guest. He did give the name of the Native American service agent that was responsible for him getting the shot of sodium pentothal and then taken to Grand Rapids and having him hypnotized. He gave that name, but again, that name is the same as a Native American that appears in a comedy cartoon. Um, but again, parents can't reach out to the parents because and by this time I don't know, they maybe have passed on. Um, he's probably maybe 5 or 6 years younger than me. So they would be rather elderly. The sister, like I said, just so happened to be spending the weekend with a friend because it was the last weekend of summer vacation before school started again. So she wasn't there. Um, he never gave names of the neighbors. He did name the other children, and they called the juvenile Bigfoot. They called him Mike. There was also one of the other boys' names was Mike, and then I believe there was a third boy um, for for a good part of the story. But the gentleman with the camera was actually there taking photographs of the neighbor that was dissecting this thing on the picnic table. So that's how he was kind of introduced into the story. He was introduced that way to me in the phone call prior to recording, and then again um, during the recording. So
So were there images taken of the dissection of this Bigfoot?
apparently there were several photographs taken. He claimed that he never seen them and that he was not aware of what happened to those images, whether they were eventually recovered by the service agent or the National Guard that were involved.
How did the National Guard and the government come to know about this dead Sasquatch to start with?
That to me is completely unknown.
Of course, there were several people that knew about it. Did the other boys know about the dead one?
Yes, one of the other friends, it was his house that it broke into where the dad shot it.
Okay, so there were several people that knew of it.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so word could have gotten out somehow.
I would imagine. Yeah.
Didn't exactly make the headlines of the local newspaper, I'm sure, though.
I'm sure not. Um, and in defense of this guy and his story, um, for my episode with him, he provided a number of hand-drawn, very highly detailed drawings of all these different situations. He had a drawing of them when they found that that den, that was all woven and with the shiny stuff hanging on the inside. There were multiple pictures of the adult Sasquatch and the juvenile Sasquatch. Literally every scene that he described during the course of the interview, he has a picture. And I'm telling you, it's not, when you look at his pictures, the amount of detail and um, the amount of time that it would have, I'm somewhat of an artist myself, so I understand how long it takes to do a drawing or a painting or, but the sheer amount of time that it would have taken him to do even one of these pictures, because if I tell you there's a tree in this picture that he literally drew in every single leaf of that tree. It's not just a trunk with, some squiggly marks around the outside and, a couple of open spaces where you see some limbs going through it. He literally drew every leaf. And excuse me, the Sasquatch, it's not just shaded in where the hair is. It's like literally every hair is drawn.
Wow, very
So
detailed person.
extremely detailed, extraordinarily detailed. Um, so why would somebody put that much time? See, these are the things that hit me in my brain. It's like if somebody had this experience and it impacted them that deeply, and their way of getting that out is by drawing these pictures, the sheer amount of detail and the time that it must have taken him to do one, let alone 30 different pictures of these things, is just, I wouldn't know. For me, I wouldn't have time to do anything else.
We had other people talk about being contacted by the government when they're having some kind of a Bigfoot encounters, especially since Michigan is a hotspot area. But have you had other people talk about being contacted by government agents?
Personally, to me, no. I have run into that throughout stories that I've read, throughout other channels that I've listened to, through emails that I've heard being read by Steve Istall out of British Columbia with the howtohunt.com and his YouTube channel. Yeah, it's not it's not a super popular aspect to a lot of Bigfoot stories, but everything from park rangers, having something odd to say, like, or having, um, uh, there was a woman who was out on the West Coast, that witnessed, two adults, and they obviously saw her, and the next thing she knew that she had been beaten and dragged back to around where her vehicle was. When she went to report it to the local police, then two plainclothes gentlemen come in and basically presented themselves as being something to do with natural resources, and they're like, no, it was a bear. It was a bear. No, it was a bear. No, it wasn't. It was a bear. So things like that. I, I can, I can tell you that there was an episode very, very early on. I did a two-part episode, and it was a, it was a gentleman who had one walk out in front of him while hunting. Um, Struggled with it, struggled really a lot with the shift in his brain that he now had to accept that something like this existed. Not prone to talking about these things. Not Bigfoot was not on his radar He is he's a hunter, has been a hunter for majority of his life, since he was a young boy. He wanted to talk about it, and he started to get extremely I don't want to say depressed, but I guess repressed would be a good word. He just stopped talking about it. He had gone into um, a feed store to purchase some things from uh, for his hunting property, like seed for a food plot and stuff. And the gentleman that worked at that store said, "How's everything looking for the year? You know, I mean, you got a lot of. Does it look like the quarters are being traveled a lot of deer?" And he says, you know, it's always been a good piece of property, but things are weird this year because I keep going out and there's these weird, like, he didn't, when I interviewed him, he didn't use any of the words like structures or anything like that. He didn't, he, he was either extremely smart or had no idea what those things were because he would describe like these saplings that were broke off at about 5 foot and the point of it would go down to the ground and then other twigs laid up against it. He said it almost looked like a makeshift picket fence. Um, well, you know, as far as structures go, those are pretty common. You hear about people seeing those types of things in and around experience areas. Um, and he never used any kind of language or terminology that would have made me hesitant to think that this guy knew more about the subject than what he was letting on to. Um, but he goes in and he's talking to this guy and he says, you know, it's just weird this year. He's like, there's weird stuff going on out there. I don't understand what it is. And the guy basically says, "You talking about Bigfoot?" And he got pissed. He thought the guy was making fun of him. So he basically just left his stuff sitting at the counter and he turned around and started walking out of the building and his wife went after him. The guy came out running after him. He's like, "Hey, yeah, I'm not trying to piss you off." He's like, I'm serious. Is that, you know, what you're experiencing?" And it took that guy a while to get him to finally open up and talk about it. Come to find out, this guy was only running this feed store for his parents because they were getting up in age and elderly. But his forte was basically a anthropologist, and he had been involved with a group who had been researching Sasquatch. And he said to my guest, he's like, "I'm going to be leaving on an expedition here shortly. But when I get back, I want to sit down and talk to you about this. And I want to get out to that property and see what you're talking about." So he said, "Okay." The guy never came back. And my guest drove past the parents' house, and there were a multitude of police cars there and police standing out in the driveway. He pulled up and he stopped. He got out of his car and he recognized uh, one of the officers as somebody that he knew. And he's like, "Hey, what's going on?" And he's like, "Can't tell you. Can't talk about it." And he said as he was standing there trying to get information out of the officer, he said there were other suits who were taking boxes that appeared to be full of file folders. You know, those brown boxes like you see in offices where you put a bunch of documents or folders in it, were being pulled out of the garage and loaded into the um, the unmarked cars. The guy told him, "You got to leave. You got to get out of here." He's like, "You can't be here." And he said he didn't make it. And that's all he would tell him, is that he didn't make it. At some point, he runs into that cop again and says, "Hey, I really need to talk to you. Can you come over to the house?" He showed up at the house, got out of the car. They talked out in the driveway, and he started asking a bunch of questions. And he told him a little bit more. He said that the entire group was missing, and that he just needs to keep his mouth shut, stop asking questions, and forget that it ever happened.
When you say group, what do you mean by the entire group?
The group of people that guy that was running the
Mhm.
seed shop, he was part of a research group,
Okay, so the whole research group was missing
was
or
missing.
gone.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And they obviously knew enough about what happened to know that he was not going to come home. So I assume, if you read into that, that there was probably something found of them. Um, and my guess is that they were all deceased. Um, but this officer made no bones about it. He said, "Keep your mouth shut. Don't talk about it anymore." He's like, if you keep poking around, it's not going to be good for you. So, there was the threat that if he continued to talk about it and tried to dig into what happened, that it would not end well for him and
Well, it's
probably
kind
his
of
family.
scary. I mean, for people that are looking for Bigfoot or anything else that like an unknown cryptid of any sort could be a little dangerous because I mean, of course, these days everyone I talk to is looking for Bigfoot. So
Yes.
whether they're finding them or not, that's another story. But there's a lot of researching out there for
Right.
for Bigfoot. So what do you suppose they would have found that would be different than, say, the encounters that of the people like I interview and you interview a lot of people I know also that have these encounters. That's different than maybe the files that they have. What do you suspect were in those files?
Well, I mean, if they were confiscating all of his files, I would assume that there had to have been something within that paperwork, maybe not all of it, but something within that paperwork that would have pointed to, discovery or um, encounters with said creature. Um, I'm sure they're not going to sit there and go through page by page there at the house. So they probably just lifted all of anything that looked like it would have been related to his research and taken it with them and gone through it and probably removed or destroyed any paper trail of of evidence or discovery.
Right.
Um, as far as what do I think they ran into? Um, a little bit of transparency here. I know this gentleman well. Um, I worked in the same facility with him for around 3 years, 3.5 years. Had a great working relationship with him. Never once did I know that any of this had happened. Um, the time that we worked together was prior to me starting my podcast. And I found out just by chance from a common friend of ours that when this common friend of ours heard that I was going to do a Bigfoot conference, he said, "You need to talk to this guy," meaning the individual I'm talking about, who had to walk out in front of him on opening day. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he's like, "You need to talk to him." And I said, "About what?" And he's like, you know. And I was like, "Really?" And I said, "Well, I got a lot of stuff going on." So I said, "Give him my number. Tell him I'm happy to talk to him. Have him get a hold of me." And he got a hold of me that night. And I got a little bit out of him. And then I got some emails from him. And then I got some text messages from him. And then we had another phone call. And, prior to us recording the episode. I think he was feeling me out to see if he could trust me, in that I wasn't going to get him on and just start ripping him apart and making fun of him for talking about Bigfoot. I think that was part of it. Um, but it's like once the floodgates opened and he started telling me about all of the experiences from the beginning of the spring when they would go out to this public land and clear the shooting lanes and plant the crop for the deer to come in and eat, the food plot, and all the different weird things. I mean, they found a deer carcass hanging 25 feet up in a tree. Um, they his daughters both hunted, and they would go out there with him and help work the food plot and cut the lanes for the shooting lanes and stuff. And he said, you know, they would see these weird little picket fences, you know, but the saplings broke over and the other twigs laid up against it. And he says it's weird because, you know, you'd look at them and there would be a branch from another tree that would be laying up against it. And the closest tree that was that kind of tree that that branch came from was hundreds of feet away. It wasn't like it could have just fallen and wound up there. He's like, whatever it was purposefully done. And they hunted around a swamp. That's where the majority of the deer that they had would come in through around that swamp. So there were four of them in their hunting party, and they all had a tree stand on, let's say, just for the sake of conversation, that the swamp was an oval shape. So there were two stands on one side of the longer part of the oval, and then there were two stands on the opposite side of the oval. And but he said that swamp was so mucky that even, you know, 10 and 15 feet from the edge of the swamp, if you were standing on that ground, you would start sinking in. So whenever they would find broken limbs and you know, stuff laying on the floor of the forest that were decent sized pieces of uh, twigs and limbs, they would break them up and they would take them and they would lay them down at the basically like the shore area of the swamp, because it gave them something to walk on that would keep them from soaking down into the muck and the mud where they'd, you know, end up pulling their foot out of their boot. They would just lay all this stuff down and it gave them a kind of a plank to walk around the swamp. Well, they'd come back 3 days later and most of the stuff that was laid down by the swamp was picked back up. And now instead of one picket fence, there were two or three picket fences. And then he was describing, you know, these weird piles of rocks that there was like literally a hole in the ground, but there were, you know, 15 or 20 good size baseball to softball sized rocks that were just in a pile. Well, you start thinking about it. It's like, how many times have you heard that rocks are thrown at people who are having experiences around these things? What if they have the forethought of digging up rocks, putting them in piles, and having them there at their disposal if they need to try to shoo somebody away? It makes more sense than something just squatting down and start digging through the dirt until it finds a rock and then throws it at it. You know, it's almost like an ammo pile of rocks. And he sent me pictures of, and it looked like freshly dug up ground, and there were probably 15 good size rocks, anywhere from, you know, a little bit bigger to of a golf ball to almost softball size. You know, and they all had dirt on them and they had moss on them. It was obvious that these things had been removed from the dirt right there. And then one day his daughters were out there with him. He and one daughter were working on something, and the other daughter was a little ways away from him. And she calls her dad to come over. And she's like, "What is this?" And she's standing at a tree, and there is a foamy wet looking foam that's running down the tree and kind of a puddle of it down at the bottom of the base of the tree where it goes into the ground. And this guy he's 5'9". And he said, like, it started about eye level with him on the tree. And he said it was bubbly and foamy. And he said it smelled like absolute hell. He said it smelled like very strong urine. And he's like, it was urine. Something had peed on that tree and marked it. But the point of contact from where it left the body to where it hit the tree was even with his eyesight, and he's 5'9". So whatever that was, it wasn't something that lifted its leg and peed on a tree like a dog does. If it was a normal sized person, they would have had a hell of a hefty stream to get that high up the tree. So, it was a number of things that he talked about like that were very, very odd. I've never talked to anybody or heard anything that actually saw a stream of urine going down a tree, and there was still steam coming off of it. So, it was a fall day, and this thing had whatever it was had urinated on this tree very high, and it was within a matter of couple of minutes because it had not cooled down yet, and there was steam coming off of it. So it was things like that he was telling me that was like, man, this really, it really seems like you got something going on in that area. Um, and then one time with him and one daughter, they heard something just take off running through the woods, and it was snaps and cracks and pops, and he said it sounded like a freaking elk was running through those woods. And this is Southwest Michigan. There's no elk down here. There's deer. There is an occasional big cat that the DNR refuses to admit is down here. Um, some wolves, coyote for sure. Um, but he's like, there's nothing that is supposed to be in this area that would generate the sound that was coming from this thing leaving the area. And then on opening day, his father, his brother-in-law, and I don't remember if the fourth guy is a family friend or a cousin. They were all on the 4 points around the swamp, and they all had their phones silenced, but they were on. And the main character of my interview, he said he feels the phone going off in his chest pocket. So he looks at the phone, and it's his dad, who is in the stand to the right of him. And he says, "Hey, be careful. There's some freaking idiot out here in a ghillie suit walking through the middle of the damn swamp." He's like, "Don't shoot at him." And Chris says, "That's impossible. We've had to get deer out of that swamp before." He's like, "It's up to your chest." He's like, "There's no way somebody's just walking through that swamp." And he's like, "I'm telling you, kid, somebody's walking through the damn swamp." Well, then the phone starts beeping in because the brother-in-law, who is across the pond, the swamp from him, he's calling. And he's like, "I don't know what the hell is going on, but man, there's something in the swamp behind me, and it's just splashing away." And he's like, "It's big." He's like, "Every time it moves, I can feel my tree shake in the ground." And he said, to be fair, because everything was so grounded in that swampy area, he said there were times where if it was really, really quiet and you had a deer walk in, you could feel the vibration of that deer in the tree because there was so much moisture in the ground. But he said, this thing, he said you could hear it splashing and walking through, and he says it just didn't seem normal at all. And within a couple of minutes, This thing had walked out of the swamp and came around the fourth um, member of the hunting party and walked past some trees. And he said it was about 5:45 in the morning. He said it was still dark, but there was enough light that you could see. He described it as almost being able to see better by not looking straight at it. Like you could see it better through your peripheral than if you were actually trying to focus on it. And he said this massive hair covered thing comes walking out around the corner of the swamp. And he said there was a limb that was hanging down low off of a tree. And he said this thing, instead of ducking down and walking underneath it, just lifted its arm up and with a hatchet chop with its arm, just snapped the limb out of the tree. And he described it as like a toddler having a hissy fit. Like it was stomping, like it was like it was pissed, like it was mad that they were in that area. And he said his dad got down and left. The brother-in-law left. And he said he couldn't get out of that tree. He said it wasn't until the sun had come out, it was fully daylight, that he felt comfortable enough getting out of the tree. He said he had his phone in his hand the whole time. He said, never thought about trying to take a picture. He's like, I had a gun in my hand, never thought about shooting it. He's like, it didn't register. It didn't look right. It was not something that should have been walking around in Southwest Michigan on a piece of public hunting land. And I don't remember if it was later that day or another day, he went back to where he saw that thing break the limb off. And he said if he stood and reached his hand up as high as he could just about get to the bottom of the base of where that limb was. And he said the limb was fresh. And he says it was about 4.5 to 5 inches in diameter where it met the tree. And he said it just one swipe of the arm coming down and just broke it right out of the tree. And instead of ducking under it, just continued to walk. And he said it stomped like a toddler that was having a fit.
I don't know if you've heard M.K. Davis's story about up where the Patterson-Gimlin film was filmed. But he was talking about, the loggers up there, and that Bigfoot did not want the loggers invading their property or the places where they existed up there.
Right.
And also, the hissy fit, they were throwing their equipment down the hillside and things like that. So have you talked to anyone about that story?
About the MK Davis story in particular, you mean?
Yeah, the MK Davis story, as well as just that whole area up there.
Can't say that I've had the opportunity to talk to anybody about that specific area. No. I guess what makes my show kind of unique is, and I'm shocked that it happened, because there's nothing really about my show that indicates where I'm from. I live in northern Indiana. 20 years ago, I could have thrown a baseball and hit the state line going into Michigan. I don't think I could reach it now. But I'm very close to that. And when I was married, I lived in Michigan. My kids went to school in Michigan, all in southwestern Michigan. Vacation in Michigan all the time. I mean, I've spent 90% of the time when I drive out of my neighborhood, I'm either turning to the left to go into Indiana to go to work. But if I'm going to have fun, I turn right and I go into Michigan. I mean, it's a beautiful state, and there's so many things to do, and all the lakes and everything. And I'm very close to the lake shore of Lake Michigan. So a lot of my stories come from the Midwest, and a lot of them come from Michigan. I haven't had the opportunity to talk with many people from out on the West Coast. Uh, MK is actually on my list to get on and have a conversation with him as well.
He has an interesting story. It's controversial, but when I had
As
him on my show, it was very interesting.
as are some of the things that MK proposes. There's some he's got a lot of things that are kind of controversial. I mean, he was one of the ones that was a pretty big proponent of saying that there was some lost footage, unseen footage of out there in Bluff Creek with the additional Sasquatches that basically had been massacred, and that Patty was apparently leaving the area, trying to get everybody's attention to keep them from finding its young. Uh, you know, there's some documentation that says that what he's talking about is actually happened, whether it's true or not. But there's some documentation from other people that have glammed onto this story, and apparently there's documentation from some people that claim to know.
Well, it kind of fit in with your story about a cover up,
Mm,
basically, of something is going on beneath the surface that we don't maybe totally understand why this cover up would happen.
right.
But with this story also, that there was some of that reminded me of the story you just told about them coming in and taking files and not wanting the story to be out there.
Well, I don't know if you've ever heard of Tales from the Grid Square.
No.
Um, it's a unique place to get stories because it's only on Instagram, and it's a gentleman who's in the military currently, still serving, and for some reason he started getting um, military, active and retired people um, sending him stories of bizarre, unusual encounters during their service, whether it would be, um, you know, shape shifting things in Baghdad, or you know, people that were on training missions here in the States at several of the different military sites that would be out in the woods doing their um, their practice runs, running into Bigfoot, running into Dogman, and he's actually he's compiled these stories and he's released them in a book form as well called Tales from the Grid Square, Volume 1 and 2. And within those stories, I've come across several where there are trained military units that are sent into an area, and basically the gist of it is that they're sent in there to eliminate these things from being in the area. um I guess it sounds kooky, it sounds crazy, right? Why would we do that? um Camping industry, it's a pretty significant industry in this country. um if you knew that there was a 7 to 9 foot tall, upwards of 1,000 pound, wild, untamed ape or relic human that lived out there, and that was their space, and they lived off the land, would you want to go camping?
Probably not.
It would certainly make me think twice about going and having a 3 millimeter piece of nylon between me and something that could potentially rip me from limb to limb. um you know Imagine imagine if these things were proven. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I had COVID a couple of weeks ago and a little bit
Sorry.
of the remnants of it. Um, Imagine if a a tribe, a clan of these things were admitted to exist. What happened to the logging industry when the spotted owl was placed on the endangered species list? Hundreds of thousands of acres of trees now are off limits to being logged. So what does that do to the paper mill industry? What does that do to the lumber industry? What does that do to, any number of industries that, rely on wood? Um, what happens if we find out that these are a relic human and they are much closer? My belief is that these things are much closer related to us than to just to an ape. You know, that's my belief. Um, do they have rights? Do we have to provide them a a safe haven, a place to live? They back a couple hundred years ago, we came into this country and we took everything away from the Native Americans. And then we had to give them, these reservations, these small plots of land to uh, continue to live on. Are they, if these things are found out, what happens? I mean, do can we not cut down trees anymore? Can we, and please don't take me wrong. I'm not a proponent for all this, but what happens if something like this is found to exist? There's some researchers who seem to be a little more heavy on the science behind these things existing, that there could be an upwards of 300 of these things per state. And that's just talking in the US. I mean, Canada, good Lord. I mean, that place is so vast. British Columbia is, you can't try to find a story about a Bigfoot experience and not run into something out of British Columbia almost immediately. So if they're proven, if they're allowed to be captured, or they're allowed to be proven to be real, what does that do to industry? Probably going to have a pretty negative effect on a lot of things.
Probably so.
You know,
But
you
also,
know,
it was interesting. You were talking about in the book that you referenced, that
quantum
the
Bigfoot.
military sometimes would
Oh,
be
yeah.
called in for the shapeshifters, or these
Mhm.
unusual things. It kind of brings me to the point of Bigfoot being possibly not like a flesh and blood character, because there's so many stories of
There
them
are.
appearing and disappearing, and craft nearby, and orbs being around them, and because like, probably 50% of the people, if not more, that I interview talk about that element of this. I'm sure that you've run into that, but
Absolutely.
I wonder if the military is called in for that purpose, because they're not of this world. They're not, a physical thing.
Well, when it comes to that, I I'm not going to say that I am deeply rooted in the woo aspects of it, but being a logically minded person, you hear about it enough that for me, I can't discount it. I can't throw that out. I can't say, "Oh, that's horseshit." That they're crazy, because you hear it so often. So I think there's something to it, and paranormal in its essence of, what does that mean? It's something other than normal. And if it's other than normal, maybe it's just because we don't understand it yet. Maybe it's not necessarily a spiritual component. Maybe it is something, like octopus. There's several creatures in our natural known world who can change the color and almost change the texture of the appearance of their skin simply by touching it, right? That's in our natural world. So, maybe that's a component to their existence. Maybe what people say is, these things are just disappearing. Maybe it's not disappearing. Maybe it's just blending in. Maybe it's not the quintessential predator. You push a button on your wrist gauntlet and then you become clear. Maybe it's not that. Maybe it is an adaptation that they've created or through evolution have been able to do. I mean, octopus are really weird. I mean, when you look at a lot of the creatures on this earth, right? Octopus are really weird. They're not like anything else. Platypuses kind of look like beavers and they kind of look like otters and they're a bunch of different species, but they all kind of look the same. Um, there ain't nothing else that looks like an octopus. Um, Something that like with reading Ron Moorhead's Quantum Bigfoot and having some conversations, one in particular with a woman that has really stuck with me, and it makes me think. She basically she was on a piece of hunting property. Her husband was in a hunting stand to the left of her, a decent distance away, and her son was in a stand to the right of her, not too far away. And she started to have some experiences that was leading her to believe that something was really weird was going on. And she was getting shook. She was getting unnerved by it. And there were some howls that were taking place that were not like anything she'd ever heard on that property before. They've hunted that property a lot. And she made the call to get her son down out of the tree stand, and they were going to exit the property. She got down, the son got down. They were leaving the area, and she looked back over her shoulder back to the area that they had just been in. And she said that the trees still looked like trees, and there were still leaves on the ground, and there was still blue in the sky. But when she looked back at where they were, and she knew this place very well because they've hunted it for years, none of that area looked like what it was supposed to. It visually did not look like where they were at. And she said it was even to the point where she kind of had to rely on her gut instinct to keep going in the direction that she knew was right, because what she saw around her was confusing her. How many times talking to somebody who has had a Bigfoot experience or having heard other stories where people talk about being so scared they can't move, confused, all of a sudden they're lost, they don't know where the hell they're at. These things are not extremely common, but they are common enough that they are things that I've taken notice in several different accounts. And that started to make me think, kind of in line with the octopus. If these things, like Scott Nelson's dissection of the language of the Sierra Sounds, he made the comment at one point that the low sub frequencies that they're able to hit and the high screeching, piercing siren sound that they can make almost would make it seem like these things might have multiple vocal cords, right? Then I started thinking, it's like, well, if these things can emit infrasound, which is coming from their vocal cords, and they can hit these high siren type howls that you hear, what if they have a better grasp of frequency? What if their natural abilities include being able to alter frequencies? If you've ever been to a concert and you've been near the stage, if something's so loud that it's rattling your head, your vision gets blurry. What if they're not disappearing? What if they're not having this crazy otherworldly ability to cloak? What if they're just simply able to, with those vocal cords, what if they're simply able to produce a frequency that makes us not see them, that makes them blend in better, that disguises, it alters the way we see? Hmm.
I think that could be absolutely true. And I don't know how much you've talked to people about alien experiences or UFO experiences, but very much the very same story,
Yep,
that
extremely.
disorientation, sometimes missing time,
Yep.
that lack of knowledge of what just happened. But also, I remember a story about a woman and her mother were headed home, and they were some distance from their home, like a couple of hours or so, and they got detoured down a road. And as they came into their hometown, they didn't recognize anything, that absolutely nothing along this road. And it was a brand new paved blacktop road, which they knew in the area nothing had been newly paved whatsoever, but they just didn't know where they were. They didn't, there were no landmarks whatsoever that they could
Yeah.
recognize. And it took a while, they were almost home before they began to see that, oh, we're here, we're already in our hometown. So that was a really odd thing, but that reminds me of what you're saying.
You know, it's so strange. And the longer that I've, I was obsessed with UFOs at 5 years old. I'm 58. That was a long time ago. We didn't have streaming services. We didn't have a phone in our pocket that we could look up stuff about UFOs or anything. So, um, my whole obsession with UFOs at such an early age, it still confounds me. Um, I will say this though, like through all the years, I have never questioned UFO's existence. And so a couple of years ago, when the government released their soft disclosure that, our military pilots are videotaping these things, that was a little bit of vindication for me, right? Because I knew that I wasn't nuts, but finally, finally some confirmation that these things exist. But having been into all of the high strangeness, I've had I've done ghost investigations. I've had some personal experiences after my dad passed away that absolutely solidified for me that there is contact from beyond death with us. They can interact with us for at least some period of time. And when you start when you're into this, and you hear so many different stories. You hear these mechanical sounds out in the woods that don't make any sense. The sound of car doors closing, and mechanical sounds, and you hear tree knocks, and if you go investigate a haunted location, what's a very common thing in a haunted house to hear? You hear knocking on the walls, right?
Mhm.
Um, what do you hear out in the woods when you're around a Bigfoot? You hear knocks, tree knocks, right? Um, Mechanical whirring sounds, very common with people who have had close encounters or alien abductions. So many of these things seem to, orbs. orbs are reported a lot by people who are in the area of Bigfoot. Do I think that the Bigfoot come from UFOs? No. Do I think they're the watchdogs of, are they the golden retrievers of the aliens? I don't think so. Um, but something that kind of strikes me is, what if those noises are simply them coming into our perception? What I don't know that anybody's ever videotaped a Sasquatch swinging a tree limb into another tree. And when you hear a tree knock, when you hear a true tree knock, I defy you to go out into the woods, pick up a limb, and hit a tree and get that sound. You can't do it. The closest you can come to it is if you take two old fashioned wood baseball bats and clank them together. That's the sound of a tree knock. You cannot replicate that sound with anything that has bark on it and swing it at a tree and get the same sound. It doesn't sound like it. So what if that's not what's happening? What if that sound is a peripheral effect of those things coming into our existence, into our perception? Why are they the same things? You see balls of light in haunted houses while you're doing ghost investigations. People talk about orbs all the time. Most of the time, they're dust particles that are being lit up by the illumination of the camera or the flash or the IR light if you're using it. But there are some that are true orbs. And those things, I witnessed one happen in front of me. My daughter was standing to the left of me. It came out of nowhere. It was about the size of a golf ball, maybe a little bit smaller. Came out of nowhere. It was self-illuminated. It was a whitish light. It almost had a blue hue around the very outside edge of it. It manifested, and then it did a little zippity-zoo, and it went out of existence. It wasn't like it took off and flew way away, and I just lost sight of it. It was there. It did a little zippity-zoo, and poof, it was gone. And my daughter and I both saw it. I got it on camera. What if these things are all the same? What if it's all coming from the same place? A different, and this sounds absolutely insane to say out loud. And when I do say it, I fear that people are going to look at me and say I'm crazy. But it's a what if question for me. What if those noises, those mechanical sounds, the door closing and the car door closing in the middle of the woods when you're 10 miles from any road, the tree knocks, the knocking on the walls in a haunted location, mind speak, EVPs. EVPs are recorded phenomenon of voices coming from nowhere. People say that they have Sasquatch speak to them in their brain. It's not a vocalization. It's not coming out of their mouth. What if these things are all just being misinterpreted and they're all from the same thing? They're all from their side effects. They're things that are happening as these things come into our perception.
Well, I find that interesting, and a new way of thinking about this. So what would cause that noise to exist when they're coming into our perception? When you say that, give some more clarity about that.
I don't know that I can. I mean, it's just kind of like a working what if question that's in my head. I don't think if you're in a haunted location and you hear knocking, I don't think that's them playing with you, knocking on the wall, saying, hey, we're here. I mean, because they have the ability, some have the ability to turn on flashlights, some have the ability to get a voice to appear on a recording that was not audible to the human ear. There's things that we just don't understand. And I think it's okay to admit that we don't understand it. I think where we fall short is those things that have been reported so many times and by so many credible people that they're not being looked into and investigated in a serious nature. I think that's where we fall short. Um,
Well, I think certainly, our five senses have limited ability for perception. That's for certain. Today, I was doing an interview today with someone that he had done some research with a woman that had taken a picture. It was a nighttime picture. She could not see anything, but she could hear coyotes in the background. And she was recording this with her phone to try to get the sound. And she was moving it around trying to get some image, but it was so dark, there was no image, that was visible. So she turned her phone from the video format to the photo format, took one shot, still very, very dark, and then just went back to her campsite. And the next day she was looking through her pictures, listening to the coyotes in the video. And then she saw the one picture that she'd taken that night, the one photo. And it was a bright streaming light coming from above down into the forest. It was vivid. You could see every color of everything. There were two outhouses, which is where she had been, was to go to the restroom that night before returning to her campsite. It was late at night, but obviously there was a stream of light that she could not see. It illuminated the forest and these outhouses, and she couldn't see any of that with her eyes. Yet when she took the photo, it was all very clear.
yeah, I mean, it's strange. I don't know that the last couple of iterations of iPhones are capable of doing it anymore. I haven't tested it, but years ago, you could take a television remote and you could turn your camera on your phone, and you could hold the television remote in front of your camera, and when you would push the button to the remote, it sends an infrared signal to your TV. We can't see infrared, but through the camera, you could see a purple light that was flickering every time you would push a button on the remote. So, I don't know if, that photograph that she got, was there some ultraviolet or infrared or full spectrum component to her being able to capture that? Was that a weird side effect of the camera? I mean, so many people take pictures with their phones all the time now. I mean, to find a picture where somebody took it with a normal camera, you pretty much have to be looking at a website where somebody is a professional photographer. And the number of people that say, "Oh, look at the orb, look at the orb, look at the orb." It's like if you have any light source, even remotely close to the front of the camera, and that includes the sun. You can go online, you can search it on Google. What are the most common color solar sun flares, camera flares that happen when taking photographs with a cell phone? And it's going to tell you bluish green. So, I've had so many people send me pictures of, just taking a picture of a field with the sun setting. And it's like, oh my God, look at these orbs. And it's like, well, if you look at it, it's at exact 45-degree angle from where the sun is at to where it hits the lens of the camera. It's a flare from the camera lens, you know. There's so many things that fool people. But when you see a light manifest in front of you and there's no light source, and it just appears, that's an orb. I've seen them dancing around the trees in a graveyard. Tiny little balls of light, one or two of them, and they bounce around for a little bit, and as quick as they were there, they're gone. It's like, what the hell is that? It's not a lightning bug. You
Exactly.
know, what's an orb out in the woods when you're having had just had or prior to having an experience with, you know, what you would think would be a Sasquatch? What is that? Is that a relic of them coming into our perception? Is that a relic of them, you know, entering our dimension? You know, like I said, I hate saying stuff like that because it sounds absolutely batshit crazy. But you know, what is
It's
it?
hard to say. It's hard to know.
Yeah,
And obviously there are things that we don't know yet. Things we can't understand fully yet. Hopefully, at some point there will be more information on what these things are. I'm sure there's probably more of a rational explanation for much of it than we understand at this point in time,
possibly.
or
Yeah,
at least
possibly.
at some point in time, hopefully it will be rational,
It will,
even
you
if
know,
it seems irrational now.
and I don't know. I don't know why I'm not Native American. I'm Hungarian by my heritage. Um, but I've always had an affinity for the Native American recollection of these creatures as far as Bigfoot's concerned. And even UFOs, because you know, many of the tribes talk about, you know, the star people. Um, for some reason I'm very I pay a lot of attention to what the Native Americans say about these things. And they all seem to point towards them having one foot in our world and one foot in the other world. I could be completely wrong. You know, I could be choosing to pay a lot of attention to that because it's a unique take and it's, you know, otherworldly, and I like that stuff. Um, but you know, their oral tradition is so rich with the storytelling. And what would be the point of saying those things? What would be the what would be the benefit of adding that to their oral stories just because? Makes it sound more exciting? You know, I mean, it I don't know.
Yeah, and it's a different way of seeing maybe, reality. I mean, our Western minds are so locked into a limited amount of perception. And maybe if you open up and are able to interpret things differently, maybe some of those things become just part of a reality that exists within their ability to perceive. I know when I was doing UFO research for a lot of years and traveled to a lot of different countries, and if you get outside of the United States, and some other, like really super Western minded countries, it's just matter of fact that these things exist. And it's just
Mm-hmm.
matter of fact of they're everywhere, not necessarily living among them, but it is not uncommon for them to have experiences with some alien beings or a craft landing or something like this. And they really don't seem that surprised by it because it's just part of their culture. It's part of the way that
Shook up by it.
they view reality.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you that there is a much different perception of these things in a lot of other countries. Why we are so prone um, to hide and to keep it secret, and you know, I mean, I get it. I'm all for. I don't need to know everything. You don't need to know everything. You know, if there's stuff that has to be kept secret because militarily it is you know, it's a concern that, you know, our technology gets out and other countries get it. Of course, I get it. I want America to be the biggest, baddest country in the world. I don't want anybody to come over here and think that they have a chance of messing with us and, you know, doing to us what other countries in the world have had happen to them. So I get that we don't need to know everything. But from the standpoint of something like UFOs, um, man, that is, that's insane. That I mean, we're not alone. That's pretty heavy stuff. How is the mass populace going to react to knowing that everything that we've been told, everything that we've been taught, all of our history is probably wrong? What does that do to religions throughout the world? You know, um, we're supposed to be the only ones. We're created in God's image, right? Um, where the hell did these things come from? And then you have the people that everything has to be related to the Bible, and I get that, and I don't throw shade at that if that's your belief system, and aliens or demons. Okay, to me, the world is much more vast. Yes, there is good, and yes, there is bad. But I don't think everything is separated that evenly. I think good and bad inside here, there are a lot of things that lean one way, but maybe not be completely evil, and there may be things in there that tend to lean towards the good, but they're not 100% good. Um, there's just so much out there that we don't know and we don't understand. And I, unfortunately, I think that there are people that do know, and that stuff is being kept from us. I don't know that I think that's right. I think we ought to be aware of what we are and where we stand on the scale of importance. I mean, we have created this sense of we are the highest form of intelligence, and you know I don't know. I don't think that might be right. Bigfoot
We may
may.
find out. We may find
Yeah,
out someday.
yeah.
If,
Um, it's crazy to me. It's crazy to me to not have an open mind.
mhm.
I mean, like on my show, I preach be open minded, be kind, hear people out, use critical thought. If you got a good head on your shoulders, think about what's being said. Does it make sense? If it does, if it doesn't, maybe don't believe it. Maybe be a little more reserved with your belief on it. Um, the critical thought is something that I think is so missed on I want to say younger generations, but I've even run into people my age, and it's like, yeah, what have you been under a rock? Do you not, how do you just ignore? How do you completely, just because of your belief in faith, whatever that is, how do you just say, no, that's not possible because it doesn't say it in the Bible? There's a lot of things that happen that aren't said, weren't written in the Bible, you know? Um,
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and call our interview quits here, but I really appreciate you coming on, and I really appreciate everything you shared. Wish we had more time, and maybe another time we can talk about some more of those bizarre incidences and happenings that you have come in contact with.
yeah, I've had a lifetime worth of stuff, and it hasn't been until the past couple of years that I've actually been able to be okay with just saying, okay, so yeah, it started when I was 10, and it is to continuing to happen, you know, just a bunch of different stuff. It's I think when you start getting into this kind of a job, uh where you entertain, you open to, you listen, you hear all these different experiences. um when you start doing investigations, I don't go out in the woods and look for Bigfoot. I think if I did and one came out in front of me, I would I think my brain would explode. and probably my pants too. Um, I'm not quite as concerned about UFOs. Why? I don't know. That doesn't make a lot of sense. I guess Bigfoot seems like it should be a little bit more natural, and UFOs would be a lot scarier. Um, but like even with the paranormal stuff, it's like when you start looking into it, when you start peering into that darkness, and I don't mean darkness in an evil. I mean just what is in the dark. Um, it starts looking back, and it starts giving you signs that it knows you're interested. And the more that I keep doing this show, and the more people that I've talked to that have had dark experiences, um, I, it seems to make itself more readily known to me. I've
You
never
know, I think
fancied.
I think you're absolutely right on track there because, and for myself and other people that I know, it's like when you give it attention, it begins to give attention back.
Yeah, it definitely does. It definitely does. And that should be a cautionary tale. Be careful what you go looking for.